Hey, my name is Chris Perella. I'm a technical effects artist in the game industry. In this tutorial series, we're going to be taking a look at ShaderFX, which is Autodesk's node-based shader editor. In this set of videos, we're going to be looking at its implementation into MyLT. In this first video, we're going to be talking about some of the basics of shaders and how we use them in game development. We'll be focusing on real-time shaders and shader creation, so some of the information that we talk about here might not transfer to software renderers like Mental Ray or V-Ray. In the second part of the video, we're going to hop into MyLT and set up our first simple shader, but we're going to start off with a high-level overview of some information. The first question I want to talk about is, what is a shader? So a shader is typically a GPU program. It tells the computer some specifics on how to render pixels on the screen. In its simplest term, it indicates color, saturation, value, and location of those pixels. This information is usually fed to the shader via parameters, values, and texture maps. Shaders are most commonly used to define how a mesh or geometry looks and interacts with lighting or its surrounding environment. It, however, can be used for visual effects or post-processing like tone mapping, blurring, or something more complicated like cell shading. In these four images, we have different kinds of shaders that come pre-packaged in Maya. They represent some of the different surface shaders that are out there. We have anisotropic, Blinn, Lambert, and Phong. The anisotropic model is usually used for brush metal or hair, and the rest are used for objects whose interaction with light are less complicated. This type of difference in specular highlight is defined in what's called the lighting model, which usually includes some hardcore vector-based math coding. We're only going to be discussing the basics of shaders and trying to keep the math pretty simple, so we're going to be strictly using what's called the game surface shader, which is the default surface shader in ShaderFX. It has all of the low-level coding completed, which is great because it allows us to focus on a lot of the fun, creative stuff. But it is important to know that there are different ones out there. If you're interested in some of the more complex parts of shaders, like lighting models, a quick Google search can return some good reading. What's important here to realize is that making a shader is essentially like making dinner. There are different ingredients that are combined together to make a dish, and those ingredients usually include texture maps, values, and combining operations, which are then plugged into your surface shader, which is like the mixing bowl, and the ingredients are mixed together in your bowl and you basically get a finished dish, and this is what we call a material. So in this slide we have a material represented graphically. Essentially we have our parameters, which are in this case our four different texture maps: glow, diffuse, specular, and normal. And we have those plugged into our default traditional game surface shader. This results in a material which is represented here in this sphere. The material is then applied to your mesh and you get your final result. This model will now interact with the light and do any of the special other things that you have in your shader, like in this one we have some glowing lights. Classically, shaders are written in a text editor using a shader programming language. Some of the languages that are commonly used are CGFX, HLSL, and GLSL. These are not really artist friendly and they're not great for beginning game artists who want to get started making content. Here's a small snippet of a handwritten HLSL shader. This particular one is about 800 lines of code. This is that same shader represented in ShaderFX. Immediately you can see it's much more friendly. There are no lines of code, simply a graph with connections. This is what we call node-based shader creation. Node-based shader editors allow us to construct shaders in a graphical way. We don't have to sit in front of a text editor and keep compiling in order to see the changes that we've made. This can be very appealing to artists who want to create some content without having to understand a whole lot of graphics programming. ShaderFX is one of those types of editors. The variables, values, and textures are represented in nodes. Here are four examples of many. This is a color node, a float to node, an add operation, and a multiply operation. You can wire these together to create a wide range of effects. ShaderFX is a highly competent program, and not only does it allow for simple creation, like we're going to be doing, but it can also be used for complex creation and look development. ShaderFX allows for a quick iteration, meaning that we can adjust values on the fly. It's intuitively based with some real-time feedback. You get to see what you're making as you create it. You can use it to create a wide range of game content, from effects to materials, and you can do that right in the MyLT viewport. So next I'd like to hop into MyLT and make our first basic material. Now I have MyLT open. In this part of the video I'm going to show you how to make a new ShaderFX material, how to open ShaderFX. We're going to go over some navigation and some of the UI elements, and then we're going to make a very basic shader for an environment asset. So the first thing that you have to do to make a new material is open Hypershade, which is Maya's material management system. Basically is where you create and edit shaders, and it also keeps track of all the different shaders inside your scene. So to do that, we go to Window, Material, and Texture Baking Editors, and then hit Hypershade. This brings up the Hypershade UI, and on the left here we have all the different kinds of materials that you can make, and material elements that you can make, but we're going to be focusing only on ShaderFX shader right here. So click that, which will create a new material, which you can see under the material tab here. And the first thing that I like to do is rename it to whatever prop that we're going to be making. So in this case we're going to be working on the obelisk from Hyperspace Madness, so I'm just going to type props underscore obelisk and hit enter, which will rename it for us. And then to open ShaderFX, you just hit the button here on the attributes editor, which launches the UI for you. The first thing that you'll probably notice are the two orange nodes here. This first one is the surface shader, and the second is the material node. These are the two things that we talked about in the lecture part, which Autodesk has already coded for us. These are the kind of the complicated parts of making a shader, and luckily for us it's already been done, and they've exposed all the important stuff for us. As you can see here with the emissive and diffuse and specular, this is going to be where we're plugging our texture maps into. In order to navigate ShaderFX, to pan on the grid system here, you just hit Alt and your middle mouse button and drag, which is very similar to your orthographic viewport. And then to zoom in and out, you just use your scroll wheel. So over here we have File, Edit, Group, Tools, and Settings. We're not going to be really using any of these, but just to go over them. File, you can take your graph and export it and then import it into a new material. Edit is obviously just copy and paste. Group is kind of like creating a folder of a bunch of different nodes for organization's sake. Tools allows you to compute your graph, which is like compiling, and then Settings has a bunch of different options for enabling some UI elements and a couple other things like animations in the viewport. So to create nodes, you right click in the graph area here, which brings up the little option box, and the important one here for us right now is going to be shader nodes, and it makes a little rollout, and in that rollout are some different sections, and in each one of those sections are different nodes. For sake of an example, I'm just going to drop down and hit the color. In this video, we're going to probably just be sticking to textures, math, and this color that I'm going to grab here. In the next video, I'm going to show you what each one of these do, but I want to keep it very basic for this first video. So just click color, and that creates your color node. In order to move that around, you just click with your left mouse button, and you can drag it around. On the right, you have the different values that your node can output, and on the left you have the different input values, for example here on the surface shader. If we take a look at the color node as an example, we have a bunch of different options. We have the RGBA, which is red, green, blue, and alpha, and then just the RGB value, and then each color channel represented individually. In ShaderFX, different types of values are represented with different colors on these little circle outputs. Starting with the green, this represents a float value, which if you're not familiar with programming, basically means it's exporting a singular value. In this case, just R, just G, just B, and just alpha. Blue represents a float 3, meaning that the output contains 3 individual values. Pink represents a float 4, which obviously contains 4 values. And then not in the color node, we have a float 2, which is represented by the yellow here. For example, the diffuse is expecting a float 3 value, or an RGB value in our surface shader here. So let's go ahead and grab the RGB value from our color and plug it into the diffuse. So you do that by clicking on the little circle output, and dragging that onto your diffuse color or your input. And that's now wired the color into our surface shader. So now our diffuse color is being driven by our color node over here. I'm going to change the preview style for my surface shader so that I can get a better idea of what's going on, and I'm going to do that by clicking this circle button on the top right hand side of my node. I'm going to hit it once, and I'm going to get it again, which gives me a nice large view. And now I'm going to go back to my color node over here and click on that, and I'd like to give the diffuse a nice red color. So I'm going to go over to the attributes editor over here, and I'm going to click my little color, and that's going to give me a color picker, and I'm going to change that to red. So there you go, you actually made your first simple shader there. Now we're going to apply it to a mesh really quick so you can get an idea of what it looks like. So I'm going to go to Create Polygons, Sphere. I'm just going to drag a sphere out. And then I'm going to reopen Hypershade, so I do that by going to Window, Material, Hypershade. Whoops. And I'm going to middle mouse button drag my props obelisk onto my sphere here. And now it's applied. And it looks pretty cool. I can go back into ShaderFX and I can change my color. Maybe make it orange, and you'll see that it's updated in the viewport. In the next section, we're going to import our obelisk mesh, and then we're going to make a basic environment shader for that. So first, I'm going to delete my sphere here, and then I'm going to go back into my shader and just delete my color node by pressing, clicking on the color and just pressing delete. So I'm going to go to File, Import. I'm going to import my LT file. Your shaded view might be off by default, so you might see something like this. You just want to click shaded view on, which is this little blue square, and then make sure textures are on, which is this little checkerboard here. Now I want to apply my props obelisk material to my mesh, so I go back to Hypershade by going to Window, Material, Hypershade, and I'm going to middle mouse drag that onto my mesh, and you'll see it works because the mesh actually turns black because there's no color information being fed to that shader. So the next thing I want to do is import our diffuse, specular, normal map, and the glow map. And I'm going to do this through ShaderFX. So click back on our shader, open ShaderFX, make it larger. I like to keep my mesh on the left hand side of the screen and then ShaderFX in the middle, and then I always want my attribute editor to be viewable because that's where I'm going to be changing a bunch of the values. So in order to import a diffuse map, we're going to use the texture map node, and we get to that by going, again, right click, shader nodes, I'm going to go down to textures, and I'm going to choose the texture map, which brings up our little our texture map node. On the right, you have all the different attributes for this particular node. The name, I'm going to change right away. I want it to be texture _ diffuse because I like to keep things organized. And then the important one that we're going to be using here is path. We'll go over some of the other ones at a different time, but for now we're just going to stick to path. So I'm going to hit this little ellipsis, which brings up the file browser, and I'm going to navigate to my diffuse map, which is obelisk _ color, and hit open. You can see that worked because now I've got a little preview of the texture map inside the square on the node. So I'm just going to grab that and plug that right into the diffuse. And you can see we've now got a diffuse map on our mesh. The next thing that I want to import is our specular map. So again, we right click, shader nodes, textures, whoops, and go down to texture map, which creates a new texture node. And I'm going to rename this one to textures _ specular. And then I'm going to navigate again to my path through the file browser, and this is obelisk _ specular, and double click that. And I'm going to feed that color of that specular map into the specular color. Looks like I misspelled something, but now you can see that we've got some specular information. I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to spell that correctly. So now our diffuse and specular map are plugged in. We're going to plug in our normal map next. Normal maps are slightly different than texture maps. Normal maps contain some, on a basic level, they contain some math information. So we're going to have to use a very specific node for a normal map. So it's in the same place, shader nodes, textures, and this one is going to be called normal map. So just click that, and I'm going to rename this again, textures underscore normal. And I'm going to navigate to my normal map here. Double click it. And then the output that we're going to use is normal, and we're going to drag that right into the normal input on our surface shader, and you can see pretty much immediately it looks way better. The normal map's being applied, we've got some specular highlights, and our diffuse map is in there. If for some reason you dragged it and you put it into a wrong place, for example, if I dragged this into object thickness instead of normal, you can just hit the wire here and hit delete, hit backspace on your keyboard, and it'll get rid of that wire, that attachment into the surface shader. And then just drag it back in like that, and you're good to go. The next thing I want to import is our glow, or our emissive map. So I'm going to go up to the top here and do a right click again, shader nodes, textures, texture map, and I'm going to rename this one texture, whoops, emissive, and I'm going to navigate to my glow map right here and hit open. Then I want to grab that color and plug that into our emissive value here. And now you can see that it's got some brightness that's showing up in the viewport over here. Now I want to put a color tint on that, so instead of it being white, I'd like it to be maybe green or something like that. So in order to do that, we're going to multiply our emissive texture times a color. So I'm going to move my emissive map over here, and then I'm going to create a color node like we did before. So right click, shader nodes, go down to values and click color, which brings up the color node here. And then the easiest way to tint a texture map is to use the multiply node, which is very similar to what you would do in Photoshop if you had a color layer and you wanted to get some color information onto the layer below it. You typically could use the multiply layer effect, which is very similar to what's going to happen with our multiply node. To get to that, we have to right click shader nodes again and go down to math, and we have a bunch of different options here, but we're only looking for multiply. Sorry about that, I had to make a quick edit. So now we have our multiply operation. Operations are basically just combiners. In this case we're using a multiply, and those operations are represented by this purple color. And now if we look at the node, we've got two inputs and an output. These two inputs basically mean this first value multiplied by the second value, and then that result. In this case, we're going to be using our texture glow map, and then we're going to be using the color variable. So texture glow map times our color variable, and then that result is going to go into our emissive of our surface shader. And if you see in the viewport, it's changed a little bit because now we're taking our texture map and multiplying it by gray. The gray doesn't look that great. I'd like it to be a color, so I'm going to grab this color here and I'm going to click the little swatch like we've done before and bring up the color picker, and I'd like to change mine to a green. So I'm going to select this green, and you can see now we've got some green color going on in our emissive map. The little dots on here have changed green and the crystal has actually changed green. I like mine to be a little bit more intense, so I'm just going to bring up the saturation and the value of that, and that looks pretty cool. So now if I were to close down ShaderFX, I now have my material on my prop here. But what I really want to be able to do is change the color of this emissive map. I'd like to change that tint without having to open ShaderFX. As it stands right now, in order to change that value, I actually have to go back into my shader, hit Open ShaderFX, and navigate to that node. But I want that node to be exposed so that exposed within Maya under my attributes of my shader, so that I don't have to keep opening ShaderFX. This is one of my favorite features in ShaderFX. It allows you to make some dynamic changes without having to have the UI open. In order to do that, we're just going to grab our color node here, and I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it emissive_tint. And then I'm simply going to click this Input from Maya button. Now you can see that our emissive tint color variable now has this little Maya icon, which means that that particular node is now taking an input outside of ShaderFX and inside of my LT. So if I close ShaderFX down, you can now see that our shader has an attribute called emissive tint. And now I can take that emissive tint and click on it and maybe change it to red. And I can change that value right in the viewport, right in the attribute editor, without having to have ShaderFX open, which I think is pretty cool. I can change it to blue if I want blue. That looks pretty good. I like that. Looks pretty sweet. So that about wraps it up for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. If for some reason you got stuck at any point, feel free to post on the Autodesk forums and we'll do our best to help you out. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at some of the different nodes we have available to us in ShaderFX and what they do. It should be pretty cool. I'll see you in the next video.